Has anyone heard of biomimicry before tonight? Fantastic. I was sharing earlier that when I first started doing this work, I'd be on an airplane or in a restaurant or somewhere, and the question is always, well, what do you do? And so I'd say, I'm a managing director at Biomimicry 3.8. It's like, bio what? But now more and more people know what it is, and it's practiced more and more. So I won't spend too much time on what it actually is, but we're going to talk a little bit about how we use it as well as what it is. But Biomimicry 3.8, so I always get asked, like, what's the 3.8? So the 3.8 comes from 3.8 billion years of R&D in nature, right? So the very first single-cell organism appeared 3.8 billion years ago. So that's what we lean into when we're looking for new ideas, new innovations, new solutions. We look into 3.8 billion years of R&D in nature to help find strategies to solve some of our most vexing challenges today. So that's where the name comes from. But what is biomimicry? So biomimicry the term was coined by Janine Benyus. She lives here in Montana in the Bitterroot in Stevensville, and she wrote her seminal book, Biomimicry, Innovation Inspired by Nature. And when she wrote that book, she gave biomimicry this definition, a very well thought out definition of the conscious emulation of nature's genius. So what does that mean? Really, what it means is that we're looking to nature as a model, mentor, and measure. So we're looking to nature as a resource that we can learn from and not a resource that we get to extract, right? It gives us an abundance amount of intelligence that we can learn from. Because again, nature has been around 3.8 billion years, a lot longer than humans, and there's a lot of genius there that we can learn from. So at Biomimicry 3.8, we've been doing this work of practicing biomimicry for over 25 years. And we've worked with some of the largest companies in the world, really kind of forward thinkers to really solve some of the deepest challenges that we face today. And we worked with, everything from helping Nike design jackets based on polar bear thermal regulation to helping some of the largest engineering firms in the world design cities of the future. It's one of the things I love most about biomimicry is that it can apply to anything. It's industry agnostic, it's application agnostic. So it's really, we haven't in the 25 years had a challenge that we haven't been able to look to nature to find a solution. But I think one of the reasons it's also quite popular and why people gravitate towards it is because it's this blend of science and creativity. And that's so much what we need right now in our world is this intersection of science and creativity to help solve our challenges, as well as innovation and sustainability, right? Our work sits at this intersection of innovation and sustainability and science and creativity, right? So everything in nature, the way it designs, the way it operates, the way it solves is inherently sustainable and regenerative, right? That's what nature does, right? Success in nature is that you create place for future generations. And the emergent property of all the principles in nature is that this principle of life creates conditions conducive to life, right? So that's the principle that we operate on when we're designing is this strategy, is this solution creating conditions conducive to all life? So the other reason that I think it's a really popular form of innovation and a really popular framework for designers is that it's this kind of remembering, right? I was sharing earlier that when you hear about biomimicry and you learn about biomimicry, it's kind of obvious. It's like, of course we should be doing that. And it's because it's a remembering, right? We as humans we are part of nature. And for so long, and particularly post, pre-industrial revolution, we've kind of separated ourselves from nature. We've othered nature, right? It's something over there that we can take that is of service to us. But actually we are part of nature. And the more we live in a symbiotic relationship with nature, the more we're all benefiting from it, right? We're all living lives that are creating conditions conducive to life. So this idea of remembering that we are part of nature and designing with nature, for nature, learning from nature is something that kind of really resonates with people and it gets them really excited. And for companies that we work with, what we've found is that it actually helps recruitment and retention of people who are working in the design space. And one thing to say, we're all designers, right? Whether you're designing an actual product or you're designing how your house runs or how your finance, like we all design, right? We all make decisions every day. And so the more we can make those in a way that is in line with kind of how our ecosystems and our world works, the more we're kind of living in that mutualism, right, with nature. So I think this is something that really resonates, and the point about recruitment and retention, as I was saying, companies are really challenged with this right now. And so by having teams having the ability to bring biomimicry into their practice of what they're doing really is something that companies are leaning into. So to do biomimicry, we talk about function is the bridge between biology and solutions, right? So if we're Apple designing a new phone, we wouldn't say, how would nature create a phone, right? But we would say, well, how does nature geolocate? That's the function that we're solving for. So that's what we often do when we're looking to design something new, or we're looking to really solve for challenges, is help companies figure out, well, what's the function that you're really solving for? So this is the bridge. So it's usually a verb as opposed to a noun, right? And this is kind of the critical piece to biomimicry, is being able to kind of break it down to that function. And once we have the function, we can emulate nature on kind of 3 different levels. And we talk about this in kind of form, process, and systems. So when we're looking to nature for inspiration and innovation, we can do it at these 3 levels. So form is mimicking morphology, so what is it? And then process is mimicking how it's made, what's the biological process. And then the system, how does it fit in? How does it work as a system? And I'll give examples of each one of these. But this is essentially what we're doing. Once we understand the function that we're trying to solve, we look at form, process, and systems within nature. The other thing that we do, if we're looking at, for example, I shared thermoregulation as a functional challenge. What we do is look at all the organisms that do thermoregulation, in this example, that do it really well, right? And that could include, a myriad of different organisms in all different kind of taxa and biomes. And what we look at is not only all the organisms themselves, but what's the pattern across all of them? Is there like a unique abstract ratio, for example, that they all do? So it's not only the organism itself or the process itself, but what is the actual pattern that's being emulated? So let me give you a few examples, because I think that helps kind of land it. And if you're familiar with biomimicry, you might have heard some of these examples. But this is a really great example of biomimicry in architecture and built environment. This is the Eastgate building in Harare, Zimbabwe. The architect of this building is Mick Pierce of Arup. And what he essentially did was emulate the design principles found in a termite mound to help the Eastgate Center maintain thermal comfort in a hot environment. So this is mimicking form. They were mimicking the form of the termite mound. And termite mounds in this environment, in Harare, or in this kind of hot environment, stay a consistent temperature of 87 degrees Fahrenheit. And which is unique for this particular environment, because the temperatures swing from about 35 degrees to 104 degrees Fahrenheit outside. But inside the termite mound, it maintains that consistent temperature. So how it does that is through this kind of intense, or fantastic design of all these kind of thermal mounds that allow that to happen. So for instance, the thermal mass has sufficient heat capacity to buffer the internal environment from heat gain during the day, and then that buffer also kind of helps accumulate cold overnight. And so these narrow shafts that you see rise through the mound, and the channel release warm internal air out of the vents on the mounds at top and out of the sides as well. And so that's essentially what was emulated in the building. So the Arup engineers distilled these strategies of the termite mound into guidelines and design principles for the building. And the complex, there's 2 buildings here, and the complex relies on this system of fans and ducts and vents to keep the temperatures steady. And the fans suck air from the atrium and up through the hollow spaces under the floors into each of the baseboard vents. And as the warm air rises, it's drawn up through these ceiling vents, exiting through these kind of 48 round brick chimneys, right? So it's kind of emulating that airflow, those thermal dynamics of the termite mound were essentially emulated in this building. And so what's really fascinating about this is that in the first 5 years alone, the building saved the owner about $3.5 million in energy costs, mostly due to not needing to purchase air conditioning. So this building uses about 10% of the energy that would be consumed by a conventional building of the same size. So by emulating this design of the termite mound wasn't just a cool thing to do or a neat design, it was actually done to help save money and create efficiency, right? Because that's how nature designs in the most kind of efficient and effective way, and resulting in this cost savings. So this is an example many of you might be familiar with. Regenerative agriculture is very a big part of being here in Montana and something we're very familiar with. But this is an example with from the Land Institute and perennial polycultures. Monoculture crops, as you might know, are significantly degrading to the soil and the environment through the heavy use of pesticides. But in this example, they're mimicking process, so how the native grasslands grow and maintain and nourish the soil, store and filter water, and support biodiversity. So by mimicking that, the Land Institute is helping farmers grow perennial crops, such as grains, legumes, and oilseeds, and together creating this polyculture that helps the farmers reduce their expenses and their dependencies on costly inputs, as well as the need to replant every year, and can protect the soil from erosion while improving the structure, and also contribute to ecosystem health by retaining nutrients, sequestering carbon, and allowing for better water infiltration. So by avoiding this annual plowing and herbicide application, farmers can avoid these negative impacts of soil disturbance, such as carbon loss, erosion, nutrient leakage, and changes in soil organisms. So ultimately, these benefits can help ensure the food and water security in the long term and contribute to climate change adaptation and mitigation while saving the farmers time and money. This is one of my favorite examples, only because this guy is so stinking cute, I think. This is a microscopic organism. This is the tardigrade or water bear. And it inspired 2 technologies that is now owned by Nova Laboratories, Vitris and Hydris. And these are based on kind of this amazing feature of the tardigrade. So some plants or animals or bacteria are able to survive in dried up form for hundreds of years, which is fascinating, right? And they do this by using this process of anhydrobiosis, when water is excluded, like in a circumstance such as drought, right? That water within the cells is actually replaced with a sugar solution. And that sugar solution thickens and can thicken up to, and solidify up to like as glass even. So the cells stay in a state of suspended animation until rehydration occurs, and then the organism returns to life. So that was actually emulated in vaccines, right? So as you might imagine, a lot of vaccines need to be refrigerated, and there's a lot of cost associated with refrigeration. And it also limits where those vaccines can go because of the cost, right? And so sometimes the places where vaccines need to go, they need to travel far, they need to remain cool in hot environments. So if you take out that factor, it really helps the dissemination of essential medicines in a lot of different places. So these vaccines emulate that anhydrobiosis, and they don't need to be refrigerated, making sure they get to where they need to go while lowering the cost. And what makes the tardigrade so fascinating, and which was also integrated into this emulation, is its ability to survive in these really extreme conditions by entering this reversible suspended metabolic state known as cryptobiosis. So that was, I think, one of the things from the team looking at this was kind of most incredible of all of this was how this tardigrade and the water bear was virtually indestructible while it went through all these kind of different testing. So they exposed it to like extreme heat and extreme cold and like all these different toxicities, and it was resilient to those. So that kind of biological intelligence really helped these scientists figure out how to adapt the formulation of the vaccines to kind of emulate that ability to go into these different states to maintain during a longer shelf life. This example, I think, this is a newer one and pretty fascinating. The idea of air carbon came from a Princeton political science major when he came upon an article about the amount of methane a cow produces daily, and kind of struck by the sheer quantity of this, was really interested to find a solution of how could we capture and process this methane. So he teamed up with some biomaterial experts and a biotech major, and together they formed this company, New Light Technologies. And so what they came up with was this technology of air carbon, which is a carbon-based organic polymer derived from either methane or carbon dioxide, two greenhouse gases that would otherwise be released into the atmosphere, and are using those, and currently using those focused primarily on waste methane rather than carbon dioxide in its development of commercial scale production of air carbon. So the waste methane comes from sources such as waste treatment plants, landfills, and farms. And through this, through the product air carbon, that they're really able to kind of serve as a substitute for what would otherwise be a fossil fuel. And one of the things I think is so kind of fascinating is that in the natural world, carbon is the building block for everything, right? And so it's only when it's in excess that it becomes a toxicity, right? And so this is an example of how really using it as a feedstock in a really positive and effective way. And this last example, and this one was really also, this was a process example as well. This is an example of a systems process, emulating an ecosystem, and this is fun. A lot of breweries do this now, but the Zero Emission Research and Initiatives brewery design and really kind of circular economy, which a lot of you have probably heard of, and food webs, right? By looking at how can this industrial symbiosis, the waste of one thing, be the feedstock for another? Because in nature, there is no waste, right? Everything is a nutrient. So how can we use these nutrients? And in industrial symbiosis, whether it's going into the feedstock of a single company or into multiple companies, is a really great example of a systems level emulation. So those are just a few, and I kind of blew through those really quickly. And really my role at Biomimicry 3.8 is getting biomimicry into the hands of the designers that shape our world. I am not a biologist or a scientist, but so I know enough to kind of maybe be dangerous. But if you have like some deep scientific questions, I'll do my best. But otherwise, hopefully these were helpful to give you an understanding of what biomimicry is. And I would encourage you, we have a sister nonprofit called the Biomimicry Institute. And together we have this incredible resource called asknature.org. And you can literally go in and ask nature about any sort of challenge you might have. They have all sorts of different strategies that can help inform. It's just a fantastic resource, and highly encourage everyone the next time they have a challenge, ask themselves, well, what would nature do? And then use the resource of Ask Nature to help them find a new idea or new solution. So that's what I have for you today. I hope that was somewhat enlightening or new or exciting, and happy to answer any questions. Thank you. Yeah. Any questions? Yeah.
Are there any notable examples of companies in Montana that are taking advantage of biomimicry?
Oh, I wish there were more. We've worked a little bit with a few architecture firms. Jacobs Engineering is one of our key partners. They are a global company and they do have presence here in Montana, so we do work with them. But not as much as I would like. I think as more and more companies I think we have more established companies in Montana, we might see that change. But we usually work with kind of Fortune 100 type companies because they're typically the types of companies that are looking out 10, 20 years ahead and designing for that. So that's our typical kind of client base. Yeah. Yes.
I'm curious, we're in Montana and there's a lot of native communities.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if there's overlap between this and like traditional ecological knowledge.
Absolutely, yes. So we actually had our whole team over the past few years have been looking at this intersection of TEK and biomimicry. And really for us, just trying to be really conscious that there were people that did this long before it was a formalized, coined term. And so we're trying to school ourselves in how do we integrate that in a mindful and respectful way, and how do we acknowledge that in our work. So a lot of work that we do is in the built environment. So building new facilities, building new data centers, building new cities. And so a key part, there's a principle in nature that everything is locally attuned, right? So it designs in a way that's locally attuned. And so what that means for us is that we have to ask not only the local organisms how to design, we have to ask the local indigenous people how do they design. So we've done a lot of work to try to figure out who are those local indigenous knowledge keepers that we need to be integrating into our projects. So we have been doing that, particularly with our built environment work, because it's such a strong connection to land and place, and there's that strong intersection there. So it's something we're definitely doing and still learning a lot about. Yeah, thank you for that question. Any others? Okay, well, thank you for allowing me to share more about biomimicry with you today.